What is described as Islam belongs to the discourse of Orientalism, a construction fabricated to whip up feelings of hostility and antipathy against a part of the world that happens to be of strategic importance for its oil, its threatening adjacence to Christianity, its formidable history of competition with the West. Yet this is a very different thing than what, to Muslims who live within its domain, Islam really is. There's a world of difference between Islam in Indonesia and Islam in Egypt. By the same token, the volatility of today's struggle over the meaning and definition of Islam is evident in Egypt, where the secular powers of society are in conflict with various Islamic protest movements and reformers over the nature of Islam. And in such circumstances, the easiest and the least accurate thing is to say, that is the world of Islam, and see how it is all terrorists and fundamentalists, and see also how different, how irrational they are compared to us. But the truly weakest part, and I conclude here, of the weakest part of the clash of cultures and civilizations thesis is the rigid separation assumed between them, despite the overwhelming evidence that today's world is in fact a world of mixtures, of migrations, and of crossings over, of boundaries traversed. One of the major crises affecting countries like France, Britain, and the US has been brought about by the realization, now dawning everywhere, that no culture or society is purely one thing. Sizable minorities, North Africans in France, the African, Caribbean, and Indian populations in Britain, Asian and African elements in this country, dispute the idea that civilization that prided themselves on being homogeneous can continue to do so. There are no insulated cultures or civilizations. Any attempt made to separate them into the watertight compartments alleged by Huntington and his ilk does damage to their variety, their diversity, their sheer complexity of elements, their radical hybridity. The more insistent we are on the separation of cultures, the more inaccurate we are about ourselves and about others. The notion of an exclusionary civilization is, to my way of thinking, an impossible one. The real question then is whether in the end we want to work for civilizations that are separate, or whether we should be taking the more integrative but perhaps more difficult path, which is to try to see them as making one vast whole whose exact contours are impossible for any person to grasp, but whose certain existence we can intuit and feel and study. In view of the depressing actualities around us, the presence of many intercultural, inter-ethnic conflicts, it does seem to me ostrich-like to suggest that we in Europe and the US should maintain our civilization, which Huntington calls the West, by holding everyone and all the others at bay, increasing the rifts between peoples in order to prolong our dominance. That is in effect what he argues, and one can quite easily understand why it is that his essay was published in Foreign Affairs, and why so many policymakers have drifted toward it, as allowing the U.S. to extend the mindset of the Cold War into a different time and for a new audience. Much more productive and useful is a new global mentality or consciousness that sees the dangers we face from the standpoint of the whole human race. These dangers include the pauperization of most of the globe's population, the emergence of virulent local, national, ethnic, and religious sentiment, as in Bosnia, Rwanda, Lebanon, Chechnya, and elsewhere, the decline of literacy and onset of a new illiteracy based on electronic modes of communication, television, and the new information global superhighway, the fragmentation and threatened disappearance of the grand narratives of emancipation and enlightenment. Our most precious asset in the face of such a dire transformation of history is the emergence not of a sense of clash, but a sense of community, understanding, sympathy, and hope, which is the direct opposite of what Huntington provokes. If I may quote some lines by the great Martiniquean poet, Aimé Césaire, that I used in my book on culture and imperialism, and I never tire of quoting these lines. And he speaks here of man, l'homme in French. But the work of man is only just beginning, and it remains to conquer all the violence entrenched in the recesses of our passion. And no race possesses the monopoly of beauty, of intelligence, of force, and there's a place for all at the rendezvous of victory. In what they imply, these sentiments prepare the way for a dissolution of cultural barriers as a kind of blockage between cultures, as well as of the pride that prevents the kind of benign globalism already to be found, for instance, in the environmental movement, in scientific cooperation, in the women's movement, in the universal concern for human rights, in concepts of global thought that stress community and sharing over racial, gender, or class dominance. It would seem to me, therefore, that efforts to return the community of civilizations to a primitive stage of narcissistic struggle needs to be understood not as descriptions about how, in fact, civilizations behave, but rather as incitements to wasteful conflict and unedifying chauvinism. And that seems to be exactly what we don't need. Thank you. Well, I think there are already all kinds of commonalities. I think the first step is to recognize them as actually having taken place. That I think also for me, the idea that cultures are somehow separate entities and exist all by themselves with occasional interruptions by people with darker skin or whiter skin or whatever is simply wrong. I mean, I think the first thing, and I think this is where education is terribly important, and probably one of the reasons why the conservative movement, and not just here, but in most countries of the world, has something very important in common, and that is the constantly accented cry about tradition. We should go back to our tradition. We should learn our languages. We should concentrate on our books and our culture, that sort of thing. And I think that's bankrupt. I mean, I think all systems of education, alas, are still deeply, sometimes unconsciously, nationalistic. So I think we have to denationalize education and realize and make it possible for people to understand that we live in a very complex and mixed world in which you can't separate cultures and civilizations from each other, but in fact history ought to be taught as the exchange and, of course, the clash of civilization. So I think that's the first step. And once you go from there, then I think we have a better understanding of the way certain kinds of conflict are wasteful and hopeless. I mean, ethnic cleansing, the idea of apartheid, all of these schemes for isolating people, and so on and so forth. I mean, I think it's fairly clear and straightforward. Alas, it requires a lot of work because you're bucking a very, very strong, entrenched position, which says that we are the center of the world, whoever we are. And all of what I've said is really intended as a critique of that kind of monotheistic position. What I was talking about was not, and I'm glad you brought it up because I don't want it to be understood as suggesting that we're in the kind of attitude I'm trying to describe. I'm trying to eliminate difference. I mean, there's a great deal of difference between flattening everything out into some kind of, univocal, homogenized philosophy, and so that's one possibility, and I'm obviously against that. I'm also against the idea of saying, well, everything is clashing and it's different and so on and so forth, and that strikes me as the major flaw in Huntington's proposal. I think it's a prescription for war, and he actually says it is. And third is the other alternative, which is what I call coexistence, but coexistence with the preservation of difference. I mean, in other words, that you be able to live with those who are different from you in all kinds of ways, assuming that there's a kind of, as the English poet Gerard Manley Hopkins says, there's a kind of radical inscape to each individual. There's this kind of different kind of construction or constitutiveness to all people in some way, and which applies to all languages, to all cultures, if you want to use that phrase. And so it's the idea of respecting the difference but living with it. human history is really a long history of compelling difference, either by assimilation or by extermination, by domination. And I'm certainly not suggesting that what we need is a unified and simplified and reduced culture that includes everyone without distinction. Everybody should wear the same uniforms and so on. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm really talking about the preservation of difference, recognizing that